Welcome to the Future of Strategy Multilateral Thinking Fireside Chats. It's my huge pleasure to welcome John Carroll. John and I have worked with each other for a long time now, know each other well. John is the head of International and Transactions Banking at Santander. John, it's a huge pleasure to have this conversation with you, and I'm really looking forward to our chat and conversation. You've been running the Trade Barometer for quite a while now, almost 3 years, I think. What have the key things been that have come out of the survey over the last 3 years? How have things changed? What has it helped you understand about the small exporter?
Thanks a lot, Rebecca, and great to be with you. And I think you know better than anyone else because you were the founder of the Barometer. And I think two key things have consistently come out from the Barometer. And the Barometer is different from a typical survey of the overall economy. It deliberately weighted to those companies which are traded abroad. So often the results are different from broader business barometers. So in the case of what we've seen, firstly, and this has continued even this year, the growth prospects of those companies which trade abroad are much greater than those that are pure domestic companies. And that's been even more pronounced post-COVID. It was about 60% of those companies who trade abroad are confident of growth. The overall economy is much worse. So when you look at growth and jobs of where they come around different parts of the UK, that's a very positive sign. But we shouldn't confuse confidence of growth and confidence in their own company, trading internationally, with lack of knowledge of obstacles. And the obstacles are around 5 areas, Rebecca, underpinned by one other point. Trusted connections. They want to get new buyers and sellers. They don't know how to get them. Secondly, bureaucracy, and overcoming bureaucracy is a massive issue. The cost of logistics, the third area, is very relevant. Banking, although we associate banking as being the big problem, for the new exporters it is, in terms of getting working capital, but it's not the biggest issue in terms of overall financing. Much bigger problems are e-commerce payment systems, managing foreign exchange, etc. And the fifth area, which has been traditionally an area for the mid to large size corporates, but I think with Brexit will become more relevant, is setting up overseas. Very easy for Vodafone, very difficult for the SME. So those 5 areas have been the core ones. A sixth one underpins all of these, and that's skills. And companies just SMEs don't have the time, they don't have the people with the right cultural or language skills in the company. They need support. And I think there is a figure often quoted by DIT that there are a similar number of exporters each year who start exporting as those that fail. So that skills aspect is really important as well.
So, I mean, there's a huge amount to unpack in all of that, but I mean, this general thing around SMEs actually not knowing where to go, how to build their businesses, and what types of skills, and it's managerial skills as well as skills within the workforce as well. So it's senior management as well, isn't it? And I mean, my own story is a fairly typical one. I started to go international. I mean, our business is international. I know about international trade. I know I'm seen as an expert in international trade, and I didn't know about practically, I knew passively but not actively about export finance. So if I was in that situation, then I can only imagine. Well, I mean, it sounds arrogant, but I can only imagine. So yeah. I mean, how does a bank help an SME get around that very profound skills problem?
Well, you need to understand that, and this is a problem that when we started doing this, because the Barometer, we did this for 2 reasons. One was to get insight, and you were the expert on, and still are the expert on the insight. But insight can be great, but if you tell a company that the GDP of Turkey in 2034 is XYZ, that's great for Vodafone because they then plan their business for 2004. For an SME, it's like, I don't care, I need something concrete and relevant. So the second reason why we do the Barometer is to actually understand what the needs are and build solutions around them. And so as an example from us, that's what we built. We've essentially built the trade missions. We've built solutions to overcome bureaucracy. We've built solutions to help logistics, online banking, and setting up overseas. So that's essentially what we've tried to do, is understand the client's needs, not what a bank thinks their needs are.
So, I mean, COVID must have made it incredibly difficult. I mean, our own data, Coriolis data, is suggesting that SMEs have been particularly badly hit by the pandemic in terms of revenues and in terms of employment. But presumably that's also affecting the geographies, because I mean, one thing the Barometer does is it looks outside of Europe to non-European markets, which might be growing as well. So, I mean, this whole pandemic has actually locked down the potential to go abroad and look at where potential markets are. So that must be affecting geographies as well.
So COVID, Rebecca, it's obvious. If anyone can say COVID's great, is a fool. Yeah. So you might be hearing me saying that COVID is negative for domestic activity. It's negative for trade, as you cited several times, but it's not uniformly negative. And there have been winners and losers, more losers than winners, but there have been definite changes. So we were sitting here a year ago. What has changed? Well, a few things have changed. Certain sectors are really powering forward. And I'll give you a couple of examples. We're looking at rail projects in Poland and Romania. They will be going ahead because they are heavy users of local labour, and politically they will continue to go ahead. The UK companies, for example, are getting involved in those projects. They're going ahead. Digital health, Japan and Korea, for example, hated the concept. Suddenly you then go fast forward to COVID. They need to be able to have digital health infrastructure. UK is an expert, yeah. So you're seeing niche areas which are growing. At the same stage, you're also seeing changes. If you look back to January of this year, many companies had a single supply dependence on China, and therefore they were completely stuck. So you've seen a real trend away from a single supply in China, not avoidance of China, but single supply, and markets like Vietnam and India really come into the fore. At the same stage, China, ironically, is the first market which has come out of the economic crisis. And I think for those of us who followed the Chinese plan a couple of weeks ago, the 5-year plan, they deliberately and strategically are making a ploy to encourage more imports, potentially for political purposes, so that the rest of the world is quite dependent on them for economically, and that may affect certain foreign policy objectives, but it will see trade there in terms of China. And the final point, which is really impacted, is the digital and embracing of that. And the Barometer says that 1/3 of companies see the digital environment as an opportunity to grow as a result of the new economic environment. This is now normal for us to speak on Zoom, and that's also much easier to do as well around the world. So they're the big changes that certainly we're seeing.
But that digital side of things, and it's fascinating to hear all of those stories, because obviously that links to the other themes of the conference as well. So we're going to be talking about geopolitics, we're going to be talking about foreign policy, and the fact that there are still massive opportunities for UK businesses and businesses all the way around the world to work together. That theme of multilateralism is something that we have to keep going, surely. But I think the most important thing that you said there is actually this digitization, because we are able to communicate in ways that we haven't been before. But that poses huge challenges, because measuring what those companies are doing, understanding what their needs are in terms of finance, the whole digital and service trade side of things presents really big problems for banks, doesn't it?
It does. And I think from the bank's perspective, the banks are heavily regulated. And so from our perspective, if we were to, and I think you've made the comment in the past as well, the whole process of regulation, and there's lots of SMEs. If you're onboarding a large corporate, you earn lots of money from them, and therefore it's a bit easier. Onboarding lots of smaller companies is difficult. So what we are deliberately trying to do is to make that as digital as possible, so that it's easy to onboard, but also easier to serve. Now, that doesn't mean that we serve them less well, we actually serve them better. And I'll give you an example. So when we talk about the 5 pillars, the trusted connections, the bureaucracy, logistics, often what banks would do, and banks are, as you know from your surveys, Rebecca, one of the main sources of advice in international trade. The problems I've just mentioned before are about new sale contracts, bureaucracy, logistics, finance setting up. So they're relevant to 3 people in an organization: the head of sales, the head of ops, and the head of finance. Banks have only ever spoken to the person who does finance. So what we're looking at from our digital platform is to target the insights and solutions they're not just the company, but the right person within that company. And digitally now, that's much easier to do. And companies want to be have relationship managed, but do they need to have someone coming every day, 2 hours on a train to Exeter? They're happy to have this now, provided the service is quality.
So business is changing, the way banking is delivered is changing, and I mean, actually, we haven't spoken about money. And one of the things I always remember from the Barometer survey is that actually relatively few international companies say that they desperately need money. Most of them need skills and the sort of non-financial support. So this is almost beyond banking, isn't it?
Mm.
But that then means, are banks actually going to be fully disintermediated in this space by the fintechs coming through, or do banks have so much more access to the non-financial support, the regulatory support, and the liquidity umbrella that means that they actually won't end up? And obviously, in the end, does this turn into a financial services ecosystem?
It's a great question, Rebecca. And I think so. I'm going to take off my bank hat at the risk of being slapped, the hand slap. So I'm surprised there hasn't been more disintermediation in trade finance. And I'll sort of give a couple of reasons why I think. I think you and I actually maybe coincided at an ICC conference a couple of years ago, and it was like, how many of you do you think trade will be digitally disrupted in the next 10 years? It was about 10%. Yeah. Probably the only sector in the world where you got 10% of the people. And there's probably a couple of reasons for that. One is it's still very much paper-based, and therefore it's hard to get that scalable aspect. It often involves dealing with high-risk jurisdictions, and therefore the regulators are high focus, and therefore that means lots of oversight by the regulator, which again makes it a higher operating model. So the fintechs haven't really, I would hope they actually become much more challenging in the future. I think where the angle becomes interesting is how banks can collaborate with fintech. So you make a really good point on banks and the appetite for finance. If you're in a mid-sized corporate out there in the UK or a larger size corporate, trade finance is the best asset you possibly have. It has the lowest default ratio, and therefore all of us want that. You are the golden client in Bristol or in Edinburgh. As you get lower, and this is the real issue about the SMEs, is that we essentially do find, I think it's about a quarter of the companies at that new exporter stage find working capital issue. And that's because there is a different regulatory environment there. It's much more punishing for a bank to lend to a new SME. So I think there's a couple of things which need to happen there. We need to be a bit smarter on our appetite. So, for example, criticizing ourselves, we have to get a certain rating, a score rating, if you lend to a company which has been dealing with the same buyer for 2 or 3 years. Well, the whole model for this is to get new buyers and to encourage new side. So that needs to change. But I think what is interesting is also to work with partners. So you can do mitigants. So I think what is coming up, and I'm not sure it's going to be announced by the time, Rebecca, that you launch, and I know Mark Ling will discuss it as well, the general export facility with the government is going to have a much broader characteristics in terms of both the way you can use the UKEF supported money, but also the size. So that's a great example of working with a partner. A second, though, is to also, why not work with pension funds, other partners who are actually going to get really low investments over the next few years, and they would love actually to take on some of those risks. And then the fourth is actually to look at fintechs who may have different models and smarter models of calculating risk, and actually just bring them in and say this is a much safer model. So my answer to that is I would love to see more fintech competition in trade finance, which I expect there will be, particularly outside the UK. The trade finance gap is particularly pronounced in the emerging markets. But I'd also see greater collaboration for partnering.
It's a whole and fascinating world, it really is. And I think hearing a bank say, actually, we welcome the idea that there might be competition here is great, because we are seeing a move towards, for example, digital letters of credit. We're moving towards you know, potentially changes in the law as well. So these are things that are incredibly important. So my final question, I guess, is this event is called the Future of Strategy, and it's strategy in the round. So it's strategy from national strategy through to a banking strategy. It's about strategic trade. What are the things that we're going to be talking about next year, John? And how do we get there? What are the key things that we need to do to make sure that SMEs are actually banked properly in trade finance, but that's also a viable commercial proposition for you?
I think there's probably three key points, I think, which, and again, this is for the benefit of the SMEs. And so I've tried to make that point. Where obviously there's lots of professionals, lots of practitioners, Rebecca, in this conference. But there's probably three key messages I would stress. And some of them may appear obvious, but it has not always been obvious how we've probably implemented in the past. The first one is really understand the client journey, and genuinely understand what is the international trading journey of an SME, in depth and from their perspective. That is the first thing you must start with. The second one then as a whether you be a bank, whether you are a fintech, is where do you want to play on that journey? So we've decided, for example, we want to play as being the ecosystem driver. We want basically to provide an end-to-end service with our partners, but which enables both trade nurturing and trade facilitation. That's what someone else must say, I just want to focus on the finance. I want to focus on the process. I want to focus on digital letter credits, but do it well. And I think that's where you're going to see a greater number of modular producers who become specialists in that area. And then the key one then is the most positive, the only positive thing which has come out of this rather dreadful year is the obvious one, but technology. And when I say technology, it's really using it for the use of the underlying client. So it's not just sufficient for a bunch of very smart tech people to cook a product in the background. It must be also aligned to a client need, and it must be profitable both for the bank, but also crucially the SME. Once you get that beautiful virtuous trio going, then there's a huge chance for us to radically change this industry.
Thank you so much, Don. That was a brilliant overview of SME trade finance, but also the SME challenge, which, you know, really interestingly is not necessarily about finance. It's about this sort of holistic approach, if you like, to understanding, as you said, the SME journey and how that fits in with various things that banks can provide. That was an absolute tour de force. Thank you very much indeed for your time, and really appreciate it. Great conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca. Pleasure as always.
Thank you.